Hello, I'm Joe O'Brien. You're watching ABC News 24. Let's cross live now to the National Press Club in Canberra. The Greens leader Christine Milne is the guest today.
The process of constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that was delivered as a result of our agreement with the Prime Minister. But it's not enough. With it must come respect for culture and country, by standing up to the mining boardroom greed that sees both culture and country as expendable. For Premier Colin Barnett to threaten Indigenous communities with the compulsory acquisition of their land in the interests of Woodside is wrong and shameful. The revelations of ICAC in New South Wales, with a former Labor minister accused of granting mining leases to mates for million-dollar profits. The conflict of interest in the Environmental Protection Agency in the Barnett government in Western Australia regarding James Price Point. The sanctioned release of polluted water from coal mines in the Bowen Basin into rivers and into the Great Barrier Reef. The refusal of the federal minister to take the advice of the Australian Heritage Council to protect the Tarkine, handing it over to the mining industry instead. The trip to India to coal magnate Reddy family wedding by both the Deputy Leader of the Coalition, Julie Bishop, and the Nationals, Barnaby Joyce, on Gina's private plane, are a few examples of why the faith of people in their parliaments has been replaced with disillusionment. Trust has gone. What we're seeing is the mining industry versus the community, the greed of billionaire miners versus the public interest. The ALP government and the Liberal and National opposition lining up to protect the interests of the mining corporations against the interests of the Australian community. And it's the Australian Greens who are standing with the people for the environment and for a safe climate. As Robert Kennedy Jr. said recently, wherever you see large-scale pollution, you'll also see the subversion of democracy. You'll see the compromise of public officials, the capture of the agencies they're supposed to protect. They become sock puppets of the industries they're supposed to regulate. You see that in the political system, the kowtowing of the politicians who become indentured servants in the US and in Canada. And that's exactly what's happened in Australia. I know that farmers in the Felton Valley, in the Darling Downs, on the Liverpool Plains, farmers from Moree to Doubtful Creek, people in Gloucester, Maules Creek and the Boggabri Forest, Indigenous communities in the Kimberley, horse breeders in the Upper Hunter, tourism operators in northwest Tasmania are all cheering as I say this because they know that I'm speaking the truth. They know that in Australia today it is the mining industry and its parliamentary indentured servants in both major parties who are working against the people. And the Greens will stand with the people, and today's decision on coal seam gas in New South Wales shows just how cynical the politics of coal seam gas and Western Sydney have become. With an election on September the 14th, Australians will turn their mind to the state of the nation, where we're heading and whether or not we're on the right path. The debate on the mineral resources rent tax is a microcosm of the choices before us in the clash of interests between the mining industry and the people. We have a Labor government refusing to take on the mining industry, to work with the Greens, to fix the mining tax so that the mining magnates pay their fair share. And we have Tony Abbott's opposition wanting to give the mining industry a totally free ride by having no tax at all. Labor refuses point blank to fix the loopholes in their dud of a mining tax, which has only raised $126 million of the supposed $2 billion it was supposed to raise in its first year. Labor is foregoing the revenue needed for key reforms, including implementing the Gonski Review and dramatically increasing funding to our public schools. It's giving up fully implementing the National Disability Insurance Scheme, or expanding Denticare, or building high-speed rail. Labor's refusing to support those on New Start, whilst taking more money out of the pockets of single parents than it has collected from the mining tax. This is immoral. As Oscar Wilde said, To recommend thrift to the poor is both grotesque and insulting. It's like advising a man who is starving to eat less. The Coalition not only supports this, but would go even further. It has a $70 billion black hole, and to fill it, the axe will fall on community services, the public service and low-income earners. If the Gillard government is too scared to take on vested interests, then it's the people who can't afford the ads in the paper or on television, who can't afford expensive lobbyists to walk the halls of Parliament House, people who can least afford it, people like single mothers who end up paying. Well, the Greens aren't afraid. We are standing with the people against the interests of the big miners. We recognise that Australia needs to raise more revenue and that it shouldn't come from the poorest in our community but the wealthiest. According to the Nielsen poll released today, as Mark Kenny noted, many Australians agree with the Greens. The tax is a dud. But it can be fixed, and a majority of Australians want a mining tax. It is the loss of billions in revenue to the people of Australia that has driven the Greens to pursue the government on this issue. I've raised the floors in the mining tax in public and in private with the Prime Minister and the Treasurer on numerous occasions, and we've introduced a bill to fix them. It's now clear that they, like Tony Abbott and Warren Truss, are just not prepared to act in the public interest. That's why I'll be moving in the Senate this week for the inquiry into the mineral resources rent tax to get to the bottom of exactly how flawed this tax is and what needs to be done to fix it, how it was able to be developed in the interests of the three biggest mining companies in the world, and what the impact will be of its failings on the budget and the future of the school and disability reforms if it's not fixed. 3 weeks ago, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition both addressed this room to launch this election year. Both of them spoke at length about how people around Australia are feeling under pressure. And they're right. People I speak to across the country tell me about the pressures in their lives, the sense that the world is becoming a harsher place, a less caring place. And different to the analysis of the major parties, though, the Greens understand that these pressures are not just about money, but they're also about time and a sense of losing a connection to the community and the environment. Not just about finding work, but about finding a work-life balance. Not just about building more roads, but actually about spending less time on the roads. And it's not just about how to benefit from the boom, but rather people are worried and are asking, is there a future after the boom? Now, neither of the major parties acknowledge the real source of those pressures, and that is the disproportionate power of the mining industry and the damage the exercise of that power is doing to governance, to the Australian economy, to jobs, to the environment and communities right around the country. Not standing up to the miners means we're creating a less caring society, a society in which people have citizenship, the right to vote, but feel they have no power vis-à-vis the rich and powerful. The young are beginning to give up on democracy. Is that a price that Australia wants to pay? The mining boom has led to the persistently high Australian dollar and has done major damage to our manufacturing, agricultural and tourism industries. Manufacturing has lost 125,000 jobs over the last 4 years, and we again saw at the weekend a government with a lack of courage to put genuine obligations for local content onto the ongoing multi-billion-dollar mining investment projects, let alone propose slowing down the boom to ease the structural adjustment pressures. The boom ignores the rich, job-creating potential of keeping our natural landscapes intact and not having them cut down and shipped overseas. The tourism industry employs almost double the number of people than mining. 4.5% of Australians are employed in tourism, compared to only 2.3% in mining. Jobs is the mantra of the ALP and the Coalition, but I warn you, listen with scepticism. How do we believe Tony Abbott when he says the coalition values jobs when he is prepared to put up to 20,000 public servants out of work from here in the ACT and send the CSIRO and any number of remaining public servants north of the Tropic of Capricorn? And that is why the people of the ACT need Simon Sheikh to take the Liberal Senate seat and stand up for the public service and Canberra's economy and families. As well as the detrimental economic impacts just discussed, the mining industry is not so much creating jobs as taking them from other parts of the economy. The mining boom has been tearing local communities apart all over the nation as a result of the fly-in, fly-out culture. But the biggest opportunity cost of the mining industry in capturing the Labor Party and the Liberal National Coalition is that they're all actively preventing the transition to the sustainable, secure, happy and prosperous society and the economic framework that is necessary to underpin it in a world on track for 4 degrees of warming. They still don't get the fact that we live in a society, not an economy, and that economic tools driving the fossil fuel age have to change because they're not delivering what society wants. Instead, they've delivered market failure and accelerating global warming. As the International Monetary Fund boss, Christine Lagarde, said recently, unless we take action on climate change, future generations will be roasted, toasted, fried and grilled. That is something you might expect one of the environment groups to say, but that is the head of the International Monetary Fund. A nation can either be serious about climate change, about the transition in the economy and serious about getting the huge opportunities that there are in 100% renewable energy, in new solar, in supporting communities as they put photovoltaic panels on their roofs, or you give in to the fossil fuel industry. As British Prime Minister David Cameron has recently said, it's the countries that prioritise green energy that will secure the biggest share of jobs and growth in a global low-carbon sector set to be worth $4 trillion by 2015. $4 trillion by 2015. But both the Coalition and the Labor Party are exposing the economy to huge risks as the world moves to reduce emissions. Already the Chinese have capped coal at 4 billion tonnes by 2015, and the Indians are likely to leapfrog the age of centralised grids and large fossil fuel generators in favour of decentralised and localised energy. If Australia continues down the path of massive coal and coal port expansion, we risk stranded assets, jobs collapse, dislocation on a grand scale and super funds losing badly. Fossil fuel companies cannot burn all of their reserves if the world is to have any chance of reining in climate change. And don't we know it in Australia? People have suffered from the extreme weather events over this summer, with the horrific bushfires in my own state of Tasmania and in New South Wales and Victoria as well, and the devastating floods in Queensland and, of course, heat waves around the country. Refusing to acknowledge the link between the intensity of these extreme weather events and climate change and the link between subsidising the mining and export of these fossil fuels and a 4-degree global temperature trajectory is studied ignorance. To acknowledge these links would be to break them, and the fossil fuel industry will do everything in its power to maintain the status quo. Labor can't have it both ways. They can't argue that they take the climate science seriously and at the same time subsidise massive mining and export of fossil fuels to the tune of $10 billion a year, knowing that they are condemning our children and grandchildren to a world of conflict, scarcity and climate disaster. When Australia takes over the G20 presidency at the end of the year, its continued support of fossil fuel subsidies will be at embarrassing odds with the G20's commitment to phase them out. But Tony Abbott and the Liberal National Coalition are right there beside the government, backing these decisions and indicating they'd go even further Tony Abbott wants to deliver Gina Rinehart's wildest dreams. He's prepared to deliver her dream of different tax zones to benefit her profits even more. He's prepared to undermine labour standards and conditions, to bring in more 457 visa holders, to exploit dams, to dam rivers, to dig even bigger mines, with even less environmental oversight. Tony Abbott and the Coalition are the party of the past. They are not equipped to deal with the Australia of the future. Mr Abbott has pledged to abandon emissions trading, abolish the $10 billion Clean Energy Finance Corporation, cost Australia large-scale solar. He wants to abolish other elements of the clean energy package, including the Biodiversity Fund and compensation to low-income earners. It's time that the critical mass of Australian businesses which now depend on the transition to a low-carbon future stand up and be counted. Get over the denial and stop cowering, because just as the Abbott opposition is destroying business confidence in this sector right now, an Abbott government will destroy the businesses altogether, will wipe out the fastest-growing innovative business and jobs growth sector in the country. And that is why it's critical that the Greens maintain balance of power after this election in the Senate. Labor, Liberal and the Nationals have made their choice. It's for the big miners and the green light to environmental destruction. Minister Burke sold out the Tarkine to mining interests at the behest of New South Wales right Paul Howes, and he was applauded in doing so by Labor Premier Lara Giddings and also the Coalition. Only the Greens are standing up for the Tarkine, the largest tract of temperate rainforest left in Australia, and the pathetic hand-wringing today of the Minister Tony Burke, saying he really wanted to protect it, it's just that he didn't protect any and he hopes that somebody else will. What a pathetic excuse from the Minister supposedly for the environment. But 3 days after that decision on the Tarkine, Minister Burke and the Prime Minister decided they would prefer to advance the interests of the coal seam gas industry and coal miners rather than look after farmland and water resources in Australia, local communities, and they would rather put at risk the survival of the koala in New South Wales. They approved coal mines and coal seam gas wells which will emit 47 million tonnes of greenhouse gases, the equivalent of 8% of our national carbon emissions, and that will come from Maules Creek, Gloucester and Boggabri, all granted approval with the flick of a pen. But now, to garner votes in Western Sydney, both Labor and the Coalition are suddenly worried about coal seam gas. But even as they speak, Paul Howes and the New South Wales right is driving for full-on expansion. The farmers have been left high and dry. The fact is you can't trust Liberal or Labor to look after the environment. How can PM Gillard or Tony Abbott pretend they care about food production and mouth support for the food bowl while destroying agricultural land and allocating vast quantities of groundwater in the Murray-Darling for coal seam gas? The Great Barrier Reef is not only on track under the federal ALP government to become a coal superhighway, its very future is being threatened by bleaching, by acidification, as well as the dredging from Gladstone Harbour and the runoff from polluted mine water. How will Australians feel if the Great Barrier Reef is listed as World Heritage in danger because the mining industry is deemed more important? What we've got is the whole Labor cabinet and the entire Liberal and National parties prepared to ditch environmental regulation and hand it over to the states, knowing full well that the states cannot be trusted to look after the environment. The plan to hand back power to the states has gone quiet, but it hasn't gone away. Without the Greens holding the balance of power in the Senate, Australia risks the repeal of the mining tax, giving up on any chance of the Australian community receiving its fair share of the bounty of our mineral wealth. We risk farmers being driven from their land by mining companies without any resistance from the Parliament, and the loss of huge swathes of food-producing land and contamination of water at a time when food security is confronting the whole world, and in a future in which food is the new gold and land and water are the new oil. A harsher, less caring society with massive public sector job cuts, young people being thrown into poverty by a Liberal Party prepared to cut their income support payments completely, and a Conservative agenda that is the exact opposite of a diverse, multicultural and respectful Australia. We will also see environmental protection taken back 40 years. In this term of minority government, the Greens have consistently provided stability, integrity and a caring and responsible approach to the public interest. We've worked with the government to improve and then pass the vast bulk of the legislative agenda, as well as several of our own bills. We've been outspoken on issues that people care very deeply about, whilst at the same time being cooperative wherever any opportunity for agreement existed. By contrast, we have an Abbott-led coalition with thought bubbles mired in the past, running away from serious questioning and spreading lies about global warming and carbon pricing. The threat of an Abbott-controlled Senate is real, and that's why it's critical to support the Greens with our outstanding Senate team around the country as a bulwark against an Abbott government. If the coalition is to be dragged back to a more humane agenda and into the 21st century, we need strong voices like that of Senator Hanson-Young, fighting to maintain compassion, human decency and international law in relation to asylum seekers. In an Asian century, Australia's cruelty at this time will not be forgotten, but the Greens will be remembered as the caring face of Australia in the region. We need Scott Ludlam standing up for digital freedom and big solar and against nuclear, and Peter Whish-Wilson advocating for the new economy, including light rail in Hobart. We need Adam Bandt promoting high-speed rail and stopping cuts to science and research funding. I'm confident the people of Melbourne would prefer to keep that strong Green voice than a backbencher controlled by Labor's factional bosses. We need the Greens to continue to fight for marriage equality in spite of both Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott acting to maintain discrimination. To avoid an Abbott-controlled Senate, it's important for people who value public education, our civil society and respect for people from all walks of life, who care about our children and future generations, a smart economy based on innovation, who want to see poverty alleviated and not entrenched in our society, who want to see the arts promoted and funded as an indispensable part of creative culture and life. We need those people to stand with the Greens. But finally, I want to comment on the current parliament. The Greens have demonstrated our public policy credentials. We've driven and delivered the biggest environmental, economic and social reform for decades, and it is the one for which history will judge this period of government kindly, namely the clean energy package, of which we are immensely proud. And make no mistake, we would not have been able to deliver this fantastic reform, which gives us a platform for addressing global warming, if Adam Bandt hadn't secured the balance of power in the House of Representatives, together with the Greens in balance of power in the Senate. And that's why it's critical to re-elect Adam Bandt and make history in Melbourne again. We also delivered the first plank of Denticare, and we won't stop until all Australians can access dental care through Medicare. And equally, after years of work, we're proud to have passed through the Parliament Senator Seawitt's bill to properly tackle the scourge of petrol sniffing in Aboriginal communities. We also drove the establishment of the Parliamentary Budget Office, a vital new institution that will strengthen our democracy by not only costing election promises, but in providing independent analysis of government budgets. And to make it clear, the Greens will unlike the opposition, present a fully costed election platform this year, and we've already started releasing our policies and costings. But these achievements were part of our agreement with the Prime Minister based on the key principles we agreed to, and they were to work together to pursue transparent and accountable government, improved process and integrity of Parliament, policies which promote the public interest and policies which address climate change. I spelled out earlier the ways in which the nation's future has been put second to the interests of the big miners. The Tarkine decision, the attack on single parents, the unwillingness to act on coal seam gas or the mining tax, and fossil fuel subsidies, all those things send a very clear message that Labor's priorities lie with powerful mining interests, not with the people and the Greens. What has become manifestly clear is that Labor, by its actions, has walked away from its agreement with the Greens and into the arms of the big miners. Let's call a spade a spade. By choosing those big miners, the Labor government is making it clear to all that it no longer has the courage or the will to work with the Greens on a shared agenda in the national interest. By choosing the big miners, the Labor government is no longer honouring our agreement to work together to promote transparent and accountable government, the public interest, or to address climate change. Labor has effectively ended its agreement with the Greens. Well, so be it. But we will not allow Labor's failure to uphold the spirit of our agreement to advance the interests of Tony Abbott. We will not walk away from the undertakings we gave not only to the Prime Minister but to the people of Australia, and that was to deliver confidence and supply until the Parliament rises for the election. We will see this Parliament through to its full term. The Greens will not add to the instability that Labor creates every day for itself. We are moving beyond the agreement as the key debates and outcomes left in this 43rd Parliament fall outside it. We'll continue to vigorously pursue the rapid transition to a clean, green and clever country, reforms to the mining tax, a $50 a week increase in Newstart, increased funding to public schools through the Gonski reforms, implementation of the National Disability Scheme and protection of Australia's precious environment, places that are too precious to lose. We Greens understand what matters to people, the place they live in, the health of their family, the air they breathe, their work-life balance, a safe global climate not plagued by worse and worse extreme weather. Caring for each other, we will campaign for them every day between now and September the 14th. The founder of the Greens worldwide, Dr. Richard Jones, stood before the United Tasmania Group more than 40 years ago and he said, "We do not believe that our time is the best time ever, but it is our time and we owe it our prime duty and affection." We Greens intend to do just that, right up to polling day and beyond. We will give this time our prime duty and affection in the interests of the community, in the interests of the environment and in the long-term interest of the transition of the Australian economy to that exciting green future that so many people can envisage but for which the old parties have given up and handed over all of that to the mining sector for greed. The Greens will not follow that path. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Milne. Now, time for questions from our media members. The first one is me, because I have the clipboard. If your agreement with the government is effectively at an end, why do you not do what the Western Australian National Party did in WA in making the royalties for regions program a condition of the support for the WA Libs to form government, and make change to the mining tax a condition of your support on any other piece of legislation the government wants to get through Parliament?
Well, the Greens recognise that the Labor Party has walked away from its agreement, but we gave an undertaking to deliver confidence and supply, and we gave that undertaking not only to the Prime Minister but to the people of Australia. And the fact of the matter is our signatures mean something. And so we are going to stick to that. An election has been announced, but we will be working to try to deliver these outcomes. We are going to work on delivering fixing the mining tax. We've got legislation in the Parliament to do just that, and it really relies on finding others to support it. And the question is it really only the Greens that want to raise the revenue from the miners? Is it true that the rest of the Parliament simply wants to take it out of the pockets of the most vulnerable? That is a pretty stark choice. In terms of, we are not going to facilitate Tony Abbott or the coalition in generating instability in the Parliament. That is in nobody's interests. We have an election date. We will work for that date.
Our next question is from Lauren Wilson.
Lauren Wilson from the Australian Senator. You've spoken a lot about the threats from the vested interests of the mining industry as well as the threat of climate change. If an Abbott government is elected in September this year and puts bills to the Senate for the repeal of both the carbon tax and the mining tax, are the Greens committed to voting those bills down twice and giving Mr Abbott a double dissolution trigger, and won't that increase the chances then of an Abbott-controlled Senate?
Well, the Greens are absolutely committed to opposing the repeal, as I said, of history-making legislation which has set us up to actually address climate change, to deliver on the $10 billion into clean energy. I can't wait for the Clean Energy Finance Corporation on the 2nd of July or thereabouts to start announcing the big solar projects that the Greens will have enabled, and I've got no intention whatsoever, and I know I can speak absolutely for my colleagues, in allowing the Abbott government to turn its back on the future and actually undermine the Australian economy. Tonight in Europe there's a big decision happening in relation to the European Emissions Trading Scheme. What Tony Abbott would do is try and isolate Australia from the big global push to reduce emissions. We're not going to allow that, nor are we going to allow him to abandon raising money from the mining industry. We will stand there and we'll oppose that quite clearly. And let me tell you, the Australian business community needs to stand up on this, and that will be part of the decision as to whether an Abbott-led government would dare go to a double dissolution, because, as I said, there is now a critical mass of business around the country who want certainty, who want to roll out these technologies, and who are seriously unimpressed by the fact that it is Tony Abbott who is driving uncertainty in the Australian economy right now.
Next question is from Paul Bongiorno.
In saying that that Labor is no longer honouring our agreement, you've clearly given up on Labor. Although I must say that I don't see that you've substantiated your case that Labor has in fact reneged on its agreement review. But let me go on from there to say, have you therefore lost any confidence that Labor under Julia Gillard could win the next election? The tenor of your speech is that Tony Abbott has it in the bag, and you're preparing to try and sandbag him. Do you think that if Labor ditched Julia Gillard, that it would in fact improve its chances?
Well, I'm not going to speculate on what the chances of the Labor Party might be or what they will do in terms of their leadership. That's for them to decide. But certainly in terms of the Greens, what I've said is that I can read the public sentiment and the polls as well as anybody else. and it seems apparent that the Australian community is saying that they will support an Abbott government. That is the fact of the matter. That is not what I think is the best thing for the country, quite clearly. In fact, I think it would be a disaster for the country. But if that is what people do, the Greens are absolutely essential as the bulwark in the Senate against the extremes of an Abbott government.
Simon Gross.
Simon Gross from Science Media. I've got a question about mining, movies and policy consistency. You're very opposed to the tax breaks provided to the mining industry. You're very in favour of tax breaks to the movie industry. You're very much for taxing super profits, what you call super profits of the mining industry, but you don't talk about the super profits from the movie industry. Consider the movie Australia. It came out in 2008, starring our Nicole and our Hugh. It was directed by our Baz and funded by our Roop. It cost $130 million. They got a producer's offset benefit of $50 million. So the taxpayers subsidised that movie to the extent of about 40%. The figures I pulled out, in the first year, it grossed $211 million worldwide in the box office, sold about $30 million worth of DVDs, so it made about $250 million in the first year. Now that's super profits from an $80 million. That's 3 times what they spent. Why is it cool to not to subsidise these rich people when they make these super profits, and to not to actually tax their super profits?
Well, first of all, he might be your Rupert, but he's certainly not mine. In terms of the film industry, I mentioned in my speech that I would love to see a major investment in the arts in Australia. I think it's a big gap in the public conversation that we're not talking about the indispensable nature of arts and culture to our way of life. But I can tell you about jobs. If you go onto the set of one of these major films, you find that up to 1,000 people were involved in the making of Wolverine, for example, and the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is expected to possibly employ 2,000 people. When I went onto the set and talked to them, these are people who are everything from architects, engineers, carpenters, set designers, 300 people in computer graphics and so on. What these industries are doing is creating a space in Australia for the arts and culture industry, and in my own state of Tasmania I cannot tell you what a fantastic difference Mona has made to Tasmanian life and indeed the economy. The number of people coming to the state and their benefits are enormous. So I think it is totally appropriate for a government to facilitate the industries of the future and create the jobs pathways for young people into the knowledge, information and service-based economy. But it is not appropriate to be subsidising with fossil fuel subsidies and subsidising the big miners to the destruction of the environment and the planet. It's as simple as that.
But do you accept that to some extent the major studios do try and game the system to go where they can get the biggest tax break?
They certainly do, and most of them are overseas owned. And in the case of Wolverine, for example, they were basically asked to price the film in 4 cities around the world, and it was going to be the bottom line of which one of those governments came up with the cash is where they went. And that is why the Greens support the 30% tax offset for films, because I think it is great for our culture and our jobs, and it's great for Australia in terms of showcasing who we are and what we do.
Next question is from Sophie Morris. Oh, sorry, Colin Brinston.
Colin Brinston, AAP. Senator Milne, why did your party support the MRT in the first place? Under Bob Brown, it already had reservations and wanted to add other commodities like gold to the import. Why didn't you just reject the MRT like you did the CPRS when you saw that was inadequate?
Well, there's an absolutely fundamental difference. We supported the super profits tax. We actually supported what Ken Henry and the Treasury wanted to do to raise serious dollars from mining industry profits. However, when the mining industry ran their $20 million advertising campaign, which effectively bought the parliament, that's what happened. It bought the parliament, it brought down a Prime Minister, and it succeeded in having the miners write their own tax to the point where they got a tax they didn't have to pay, and Prime Minister Gillard and Wayne Swan got an outcome of a negotiation which now has come home to bite them. We supported it because we think the mining industry should pay the tax, and that was the best we could do at the time, but we moved amendments at the time recognising the flaws in the tax, including the one in relation to royalties. So it's not as if we haven't been there, and I can tell you myself that Bob Brown sat opposite Wayne Swan and eyeballed him at that time and said, these are the flaws in this tax and they must be fixed, and he refused to fix them. And they refused to fix them because they said they'd done the deal with the mining industry and they weren't at liberty to make any changes. And that is the extent to which the mining industry owns the parliament, for goodness sake. So that's why we supported it, because some dollars are better than no dollars, but we want it fixed so that we get a genuine return. In terms of the comparison with the carbon pollution reduction scheme, the difference there is that something was not better than nothing. What that did was effectively cap the level of ambition on which you could with which you could reduce emissions, and what we have now is far superior, because not only do we have a foundation which you can build on to increase the level of ambition, but we've got $10 billion into renewable energy, we've got energy efficiency, we've got the Carbon Farming Initiative, the Biodiversity Fund and the Climate Change Authority. The Climate Change Authority is a single great new institution in Australia, and it is going to bring rigour and integrity to the debate on emissions. And the rather delicious thing, which people may not have taken note of, is that it's going to put out its discussion paper a month after the federal election. Whoever wins is going to be campaigning in the context of the Climate Authority, asking people and considering what is the level of emissions reduction that Australia ought to bear as a fair share of our global burden.
Next question is from Sophie Morris.
Sophie Morris from the Australian Financial Review. Senator Milne, you've said that the Australian business community needs to get involved in the discussion and resist the repeal of the carbon tax. This echoes a call you made when you became leader for the business community to be more outspoken on these issues. Are you implying there that are you disappointed with that there hasn't been a response to that rallying call that you put out to business to take a different view to some of the representative groups? And are you implying that the business community in Australia has been cowed? It's also owned by the mining industry, as you've said the parliament is.
I'm certainly very disappointed. You're right on that score. I simply cannot understand why industries whose very existence and future business plan depend on emissions trading, depend on increasing levels of ambition, depend on leveraging private sector finance with the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, why they would not stand up and say so. And when I've spoken to them, the fact of the matter is they're afraid. They're afraid if they stand up that they'll somehow lose access under a coalition government. And I say to them, the coalition is already undermining confidence. It's already doing that. Can you imagine what it will do if it gets in? So it's time to stand up, and that's really the challenge. The Greens can only do so much, and we will stand as a bulwark against Tony Abbott. But it's really over to those businesses to determine whether they want this going on at all. The fact that you had Andrew Robb write to the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and ask them to break the law ought to have been a rallying call for business in Australia. How outrageous is that? What does that say about business management? And yet it just passed by as if it was a reasonable thing to do. So yes, I want the business community to stand up, and I suggest that they're afraid to because they believe that the coalition will be in government and they're frightened of access, and I think they think that if they keep their heads in the sand and go quiet, it mightn't happen.
Mark Kenny.
Senator Milne, Mark Kenny from The Age and Sydney Morning Herald. It's widely believed that Julia Gillard erred by appearing with the Greens when she announced the decision to go to a carbon price. I'd like your judgment about that. Do you accept that that was a tactical error by her? And would you object to moving more quickly to an emissions trading scheme, as some have suggested that Kevin Rudd would do were he returned to the Labor leadership? And if I could just add one further question. Yep. You said some very negative things about the resources boom. Can I just sort of clarify that? Are you saying it is all bad? Is there anything good about the resources boom?
Okay. Just to answer some of those questions on the resources boom, of course, the resources boom has created jobs in some parts of Australia, but it's also created the fly-in, fly-out culture, which has led to many people in remote communities and isolated communities actually having to leave because they can no longer afford the rent. So what I'm saying is that it has created some benefit to the country, but what we should have done is captured that benefit with a sovereign wealth fund, for example, so that you can genuinely use the benefits of the boom to make the transition. But what has happened is we have allowed those mining companies to break the social contract, if you like, or dominate the parliamentary and public discourse to the detriment of the community, and that has been the problem. In terms of was it a mistake for the Prime Minister to stand with the Greens? Not at all. The problem was that I don't think the press gallery or the community either, for that matter, actually understand what a shared parliament looks like or what minority government looks like. It's much more common in the States. You would not see the same kind of comment being made if it happened in Tasmania, for example, where we've got 2 Greens in Cabinet. You wouldn't see it in other parts of the country, but because it's the first time you've had a minority government scenario in the federal government in living memory, then you have that kind of outrage. But it's entirely appropriate. We have a carbon price in Australia because of the Greens. Make no mistake, if it had been Liberal on its own or Labor on its own as a majority, we would not have acted on climate change. We would have no carbon price. We would not have set Australia up for the future. And I can tell you the history books are going to record this as a great thing Australia did. And the International Energy Agency has already said, congratulations to Australia, this is template legislation. And
Just on the emissions trading scheme, would you move to it more quickly?
Okay. On the emissions trading scheme, the reason that we went to a fixed price period going into flexible pricing is because Labor and the Greens could not agree on the level of ambition, the level of the cuts that you would need, which is why we set up the Climate Change Authority, which is why they're required to report at the beginning of next year on the emissions budget, and then we can go to flexible trading. You really can't go to flexible trading sooner than that because the budget is predicated on the compensation payments that are being made, particularly in relation to the tax-free threshold. So if you want to go earlier, there are going to be really significant budget ramifications. But you couldn't go earlier than the Climate Change Authority's capacity to recommend to the Parliament what the target should be.
Next question is from Catherine Murphy.
Senator Milne, Catherine Murphy from The Age. You've said in this address today that you won't break your agreement, your written agreement with Labor, but you've called upon the government to, in effect, break their written agreement with the mining industry. So just as a point of principle, why is it okay for the Labor Party to break agreements with people but not the Greens? In terms of you've also argued in this speech something quite significant, which is that business in effect has captured the parliament, and that's, if true, diabolical for democracy. So I'll circle you back round to Lyndall's question. Then shouldn't you push this mining tax issue to the nth degree? Isn't it a moral imperative and not something that you should stand behind a written agreement to prevent yourselves from having to do?
Okay, so just as I have said before in relation to this mining tax, we will move to fix it. We will use our position in the Parliament to fix it, and the question that will answer your second question, to the extent to which the Parliament is already captured by the mining industry as to whether we can get a majority. As to whether the Greens should stand by an agreement with the government and they shouldn't stand by an agreement with the mining industry, what is going on when a Prime Minister and a Treasurer get in a back room with 3 mining companies and stitch up a deal and take it to the Parliament and say that the elected representatives of that country can't amend that deal because it is a private deal in a back room with a Treasurer and a Prime Minister and 3 mining companies, and even Treasury have now said they didn't know what was stitched up in that room. If ever there was an answer to your last question, which is the extent to which the Parliament is owned by the mining industry, that's it.
David Spears.
David Spears from Sky News. I just want to go to this issue of ending effectively the agreement with the government. How have they broken the deal? Is it by, as you suggest there, dudding or duping the Parliament on the details of the mining tax? I mean, you did ultimately vote for it. You're saying that you were duped about what it involved. And more importantly, what does this now mean, ending the agreement? You've said supply and confidence will continue until the election. What does it mean in practice, though, if the agreement's ended? Does it affect meetings that you may or may not have with the Prime Minister, Treasury costings of Greens policies? And did you inform Julia Gillard of this?
Okay. So what does it... well, first of all, how have they broken the agreement? As I said, there were 4 principles on which the agreement was based. There was the principle of transparent and open government, there was the principle of the national interest, and there was the principle of working together to address climate change. They were the 3 that I'm referring to. And in all cases, they have broken those. On transparency, we had to force them to release the figures on the mining tax. They would not do that without having been forced in the Parliament. In terms of the public interest, they are not acting in the public interest in terms of the mining tax and are determined not to do so. But nor are they acting in the public interest when it comes to the Tarkine decision, when it comes to coal seam gas, when it comes to handing over environmental regulation to the states. They have unilaterally decided to act on their own against the public interest. And thirdly, on climate change, they are engaged in pushing a huge expansion in coal exports, coal seam gas, massive increase of greenhouse gases to atmosphere. How can you say you are working together to address climate change when you are going to send offshore 3 times the level of Australia's emissions? That is clearly in breach. In terms of the fact, did I tell the Prime Minister just before I came to speak with you today, I spoke with the Prime Minister on the phone and let her know that I would be telling people today that the government had walked away from its agreement with the Greens, that the government had broken its agreement with the Greens. So I felt I owed her the courtesy to do that. That is in a respectful relationship, but they have ended it. We haven't ended it. They have walked away. Make that very clear in that context. In terms of what it means, well, there's no point in having meetings if the meetings are only there to be told what the Labor Party has already decided to do. I can read that in the paper or get it by letter. What I would like, though, is to let everybody know, and the Prime Minister included, is that my door is open and so is the door of every one of my colleagues to negotiate on pieces of legislation. As I indicated, in this moving beyond that agreement period, we will work with the government, with the Parliament, with whoever we can to fix the mining tax, to deliver the money, to implement public education. We'll work with that, and my door is open to genuine negotiation. But there is no point in trying to pretend that something is working when it's not. Let's just be upfront, and I think people are going to be actually really happy with that because the community are now clear. We've got a clear run to the election. There will be no antics that the Greens support from that the coalition may perpetrate. We offer confidence and supply because that's in our agreement, and we are not walking away from our signatures on that agreement. But we are acknowledging that Labor has walked away from our agreement. Well, so be it. But it's now a full-on election campaign from everyone, and it's really the Greens versus the rest in terms of the public interest.
Steve Lewis.
Senator Milne, Steve Lewis from News Limited. Could I ask you a question about the Greens' election strategy, if you like? A couple of weeks ago, Graham Wood announced that he would not be providing I think it was $1.6 million donation from 2010 for this election campaign. Can you, first of all, confirm that is the case? Number two, what sort of a hole is that likely to put in your election campaign? And further to that, can you just confirm that your plan at this stage, the party's plan, is to run candidates in each of the lower house seats at the federal campaign? And where do you think the Greens have a realistic chance of winning any further lower house seats, obviously in addition to Melbourne?
Okay. Well, I heard the same interview. I haven't spoken with Graham Wood personally, but yes, I understand that he isn't going to offer such, and what a generous donation that was, and effectively that donation helped the Greens to get a record vote last time and enabled us to deliver that groundbreaking legislation. So that's great. And thanks for the opportunity for allowing me to fundraise at the Press Club. It's certainly true that 1.6 million not flowing into the Greens coffers means that we need to fundraise around the country, and so we are keen for people to work with us on fundraising, and anybody who'd like to donate to us within the rules, we'd be delighted to receive that funding. And yes, we will be contesting every seat around the country, and indeed putting up a very strong Senate team around the country as well. We will be focusing, of course, on the re-election of Adam Bandt in Melbourne, and what an exciting time that's going to be, and I'm pretty confident, as I said, that the people of Melbourne are going to return a strong Adam voice for Melbourne, compared with what they would get with just a factional person from the Labor Party, a backbencher. So I'm pretty confident that's going to happen, and we'll be running strong lower house seats as campaigns around the country, but our predominant effort is going to be to return our sitting members and focus on the inner city seats around the country where we think we can improve our vote.
Ken Randall.
Senator Ken Randall from Media Monitors. Could I just take you back to an earlier question and ask what you think about this rather bizarre concept that after Julia Gillard announced here on the 30th of January that she intended to call an election on the 14th of September, that it was a caretaker period beginning then, and that the opposition needed to be consulted about major appointments, major decisions, and as you pointed out earlier, even decisions of new statutory authorities. What's the Greens' position on all of those issues?
Okay, well, it's total hogwash. It's just a simple answer to that. It is not a caretaker period. That is utter nonsense. We know when the election is. We know that the date that it is to be called, and we go into a caretaker period at that time. Up until then, it's normal government business. And I say again, it's utterly disgraceful, economically irresponsible for the coalition to be asking statutory authorities to break the law. And people who when they tick the box in polls saying that they think the coalition would be responsible economic managers need to think about what sort of economic managers would want to build 100 dams across the north, would want to send the CSIRO to Karratha, want to send 20,000 public servants onto the streets and the rest to the north of Australia. It is just madness. And as for their direct action on climate change, that is, the joke of the century in terms of climate circles. So I think that it was the biggest try-on, and it relied on assuming that the community didn't actually get it, but they did, and it made the coalition look pretty silly.
And I'll ask one final question, I think, to follow up something David Spears asked. Will you still look at getting policies costed by Treasury? The other question was, given there is some internal criticism in the Labor Party and from some of Labor's own base about its closeness to the Greens, do you think there will be some in the Labor Party who don't mind at all if there's a bit of distance between the two parties?
Oh, well, I've got no doubt that Paul Howes and others have been fully behind this walking away from the Greens and from the agreement. They've been driving that for some time. to the detriment of the public interest, and it's the old factional bosses and it's the old deals that are being done in back rooms, well, over to them. But I think the community is really pleased that the Greens have stood by our agreement throughout and will continue to offer confidence in supply. And frankly, Labor's internal fights would exhaust you if you even tried to absorb half the horror that goes on there, so I just ignore that and just see it for what it is. It is a party riven with internal dissension, and we're not going to allow all their fights, internal fights, to distract us from getting on with delivering good outcomes for people and caring for the environment in Australia as people want.
That's where we'll have to leave it. Can you please all thank Senator Christine Milne?